It's helpful to learn how to distinguish between emotions and vibes. Although they overlap, they're not inherently the same thing. An emotion is more of a psychological response to a certain kind of stimuli. A vibration is something a little bit different. So if we think about it in terms of an exchange of energy, it's something that's happening more on the outside of our bodies between you and I. I might have my emotional reaction to you, but then there's also a vibrational exchange between us. Those two things overlap, but they're not inherently the same.
This is A Joyful Rebellion, the podcast that explores that moment you realize the life and success you worked so hard to create didn't come with all the fulfillment you thought it would. I'm your host, James Walters, and I want you to be the author of your own story. Each week, I connect with people who inspire bold answers to the question, what do I do now to create a life I love? If you're ready to start answering that question for yourself, you're in the right place. So let's start a joyful rebellion. Vibe is a word that gets thrown around a lot. From casual verbal communication to t-shirts and home decor, it's one of those words you hear people use, though few of those people could articulate exactly what it is. Jason Gandio has a PhD in communication studies, and he's been studying vibes for 30 years. He's a published author, an award-winning teacher, and an engaged intellectual. And over the course of our conversation, Jason and I peel back the layers of the concept of the vibe, its history, how it shows up in other cultures, and what you need to know if you want your vibe to be the best it can be. Jason, thank you so much for being here on our Joyful Rebellion. I'm excited to talk to you because vibe is a word that gets thrown around a lot in today's culture. I see it on t-shirts. I hear people talking about it. You see a sign in someone's house that says good vibes only. And you've been studying this and not just casually interested in it. You studied this as part of your PhD, your doctorate. So it seems like you're the guy to go to if we're talking about vibes and understanding what the heck that means. Exactly, because I know I throw a lot of words around. Like sometimes I'll say, I got to get my chi aligned, and that sounds right, but literally I don't know what it means. Tell us a little bit, maybe explain how you came to understand what the word vibe meant, what the concept behind it is, and what we get right about it and what we get wrong about it.
I first started thinking about the vibe or vibes in the plural in my late teens and early 20s. I was part of different bohemian cultures, subcultures, countercultures, early rave scene, jam band scenes, underground house parties, etc. And everyone in these groups and these scenes, including myself, was talking about the vibe of the music, of the DJ, of the party last night, etc. And at some point I realized, well, we're all talking about it, and I think we're all experiencing it, but yet no one's really defining it or explaining it. So it kind of piqued my interest really at the age of about 18 or 19 years old.
All right.
And so I started thinking about it casually at that age. And then actually I wrote my first paper on the vibe as a college student, I guess it was my senior year, in a class on nonverbal communication. Then from there, though, I decided to go to grad school and use my graduate work to study this thing we call the vibe. So I used my master's thesis as well as my doctoral dissertation to write about the vibe and create my own philosophy of the vibe.
All right.
Now to back up just for a second for your listeners, what do we mean by this? I'll give some basic examples. So you're on a first date. And obviously on the first date, you're looking to connect with the other person. And my guess is a lot of people might use the word vibe. Like, was it a good vibe last night on the dates? Was it a romantic vibe? Was it a sexual vibe? Was it a friendly vibe, but not romantic? Was it a total dud whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of experience that you have with other people. Other examples might include going to a musical concert, right? And there's a vibe from the band or the musician. There's a vibrational connection between you and the crowd. The same kind of thing could be said about in sports, right? You're at a baseball game, a football game, a soccer game. There's 80,000 people screaming for their team, right? And you can feel that energy in the crowd.
Mm.
So from there, the question is, well, what is this experience that we're talking about? And I'll give you two definitions. The first definition, pretty basic, is the exchange of energy between you and other people. So again, the exchange of energy between you and other people. Now from there, though, the question becomes, what is the nature of this energy? Right, so in many ways, we're kind of just flipping words around. We're not getting anywhere. So there's different ways to think about the nature of that energy. For instance, is it physical or metaphysical? Is it spiritual or scientific? Is it material or immaterial? Is it all these things, none of these things, something else altogether? Right? So there's a lot to think about here. We talk about trying to explain this basic word.
Right.
Then another way that I define it, and this really comes out of my dissertation and my philosophy of the vibe, is that I think about the vibe as bodily emanation, which is to say that our bodies emanate or radiate a felt and tangible energy that I and other people can experience. So bodily emanation. Right? I'll pause there for now. So we have the exchange of energy between you and other people, and also the notion of bodily emanation, which our bodies emanate a felt, tangible energy.
All right. So that covers a lot. I guess my first question there is, do you find it to be something that's more emotional, intuitive, spiritual, or is it physical, or is it a combination of those things?
And thinking about this over the years, which obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, my own approach currently is to take as broad of approach as possible. So rather than trying to advocate for one paradigm as being physical or metaphysical or spiritual scientific, it's like, well, maybe it comes across all these paradigms. And I do that to allow people to access the experience and the knowledge about the vibe in their own kind of way. So maybe this thing that we call the vibe, maybe it's used so often and in so many different ways, is because it is elusive. So what exactly is it? And I don't know. Like I don't have the answer. Right? I can theorize about it, I can philosophize about it. And I think there are different kinds of vibes. For instance, if we talk about music and let's say sound, all sound is in fact a physical vibration, right? Yeah. The way that sound works is that you have two objects or two forces that come into contact with each other. They literally make each other vibrate, and that vibrates the air around them. And those air vibrations then enter into our ears, and our brain changes that sound into meaning. That's a physical vibration.
Right.
Then you talk about emotions. Like, well, when you listen to music, music obviously evokes different kinds of emotions. Right? At the same time, though, one of the things I try to tell people is that it's helpful to learn how to distinguish between emotions and vibes. Although they overlap, they're not inherently the same thing. So an emotion is more of a psychological response to a certain kind of stimuli, whether it's a real stimuli or perceived, and we have an emotional reaction to it. A vibration is something a little bit different. So if we think about it in terms of an exchange of energy, it's something that's happening more on the outside of our bodies between you and I.
Okay.
Right? I might have my emotional reaction to you, but then there's also a kind of a vibrational exchange between us. Those two things overlap, but they're not inherently the same thing.
Got it. That was another thing I was curious about. Is a vibe kind of a situational thing, or do people carry a vibe with them, or are both of those things true? Like the music concert example you gave, the band is kind of setting the situation and the context of whatever kind of vibe it is. And like you said, the type of music, the type of vibrations, and the way people filter those through their own experience can create an emotion. And then whether that's something nostalgic, whether that's something really amped up, or something just completely random for that person if they've never heard the music before. But do people wake up in the morning with their own vibe that they're creating their own circumstance with?
I would say yes to all of it, right?
Okay.
Each person has their own vibe, just like they have their own personality, right?
Yeah.
I've never met a person that didn't have a certain kind of vibe. And that vibe literally is telling you something about who they are, their background, their identity, and so on. At the same time, each person gives off a different vibe depending on the situation, circumstances, the mood they're in, the phone call they just had, the television show they're just watching, right? So although you have a basic vibe that stays with you, for throughout your day and throughout your life, you can also give off different vibes depending on what's happening around you in the moment.
Okay. So is this the same thing? I've watched some YouTube things that some folks who are spiritual and maybe do meditations, that kind of thing. And they're talking about vibrations and they relate them to emotions. And they say like shame, for example, is one of the lowest vibrations leading to depression, and lower your vibration, the closer you are to depression. Then on the other end of the scale, gratitude is one of the higher vibrations, and that will lead to happiness. Do these have anything to do with the vibes you're studying and talking about?
Yeah, it's all part of the same conversation. It may not be exactly the same explanation, but it's part of the same orientation.
Okay.
And I would agree that each emotion brings with it its own kind of vibe. So if you're really happy, you're giving off a happy vibe, obviously.
Yeah.
If you're really sad or depressed, you're giving off a sad or depressed vibe. And to think about that for a second, if you walk into a room, you walk into a store, you're walking down the street, and someone's just super happy, don't they change you a little bit? Like it's infectious. You can feel it.
Yeah. They do.
Or if you have a friend who is sad or depressed, and as soon as you walk into the room, you know right away something's wrong. And of course, with this, we have to talk about nonverbal communication, the way they present themselves, body language, how do they physically look. But in addition to all of those experiences, there's also this thing that we call the vibe, One of the things I try to do in my own work is that I don't want to conflate all these things into the same category. Because if we do that, like, well, then how do we understand anything, right? So emotion has its place, nonverbal communication has its place, psychology has its place, and of course, this thing that we're calling the vibe also has its place. I don't want to conflate all these things together.
Got it. That's
now,
important.
They overlap. If you think of a multi-sided coin, if that exists, like it's all part of the same coin, just different sides.
When it comes to a person's vibe, it could be situational. So if they just got bad news, their vibe is going to be a little bit different. But have you found in your research that people tend to have baseline vibe that maybe goes up and down based on the circumstance, but they come back to that set point?
That's a good question. I don't think I've studied exactly the way that you're asking the question, but just here in the moment, I would say yes. There's a baseline to everyone's vibe, right? It's kind of their vibrational signature, their vibrational personality, so to speak.
Yeah.
And of course, like all aspects of personality, it can be a little bit high, a little bit low, a little off one day, a little energized, a little slow, but there's a baseline there, and you kind of zigzag back and forth within your baseline.
Okay.
Now, if the question becomes, how might we change our vibe or alter our vibe? All kinds of ways you can do that. It's like, how do you change your personality? How do you change your mindset? How do you change your orientation to the world? And I think that is possible. The basic ways to think about this is, one, be aware of your body. In other words, attend to your body on a regular basis. How am I feeling? Any tension, any happiness, any sadness? Am I holding on to any kind of emotions? What's my body doing right now? Likewise, be aware of your surroundings. In other words, attention to your surroundings. So be aware of your body as well as your surroundings. Then be aware of the vibe that you're giving off, right, on a constant basis. And if you find yourself like, well, I don't really like the vibe I'm giving off on a regular basis, the question is, how do I change that? And that really begins with a shift in mindset. Being aware of my thoughts. Like if I tend to have negative thoughts, how do I have less negative thoughts? If I tend to have depressive thoughts, how do I have less depressive thoughts? Having said all of this, I do not believe that it's just mindset. Like if I wish it to happen, it's going to happen. I know it's a big thing in our society, like only good vibes, only happy vibes. Like, well, if that was the case, we'd all be millionaires. Like, how come I don't have $1 million right now?
Yeah.
That's not how the world works. But there is some control and some self-agency in terms of the vibe we give off, and then, of course, how we live our lives on a daily basis.
Have you found this across culture, across time periods? What I mean by that is we know what it means culturally, but have you seen a shift in it as the world has gotten a little bit faster, a lot more connected through the internet? Back in the day where things were simple and people didn't maybe have more than a dozen or so people that they connected with in any given week or month because they were just geographically isolated on a farm or transportation was scarce, whatever the situation was. And now we are so connected. Is it different?
It's a great question. And my mind's going a lot of different ways. And I mean that in a good way right now. One of the things I'm thinking about relative to your question is whether or not our contemporary society with social media, instant communication, FaceTiming, all those kinds of things produces more awareness of the vibe or less awareness. And in this moment, don't quote me on this, but in this moment, I say it might actually lead to less awareness because we're so overloaded with information. I think the mind starts to shut down. You can't take everything in. So if your mind is boggled down with all the information of the world all the time, you're probably less aware of your body, less aware of your situation and your surroundings and so on. I could be wrong about this. I'm just speculating in this moment.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, because of our communication technologies nowadays, you have more access to cultures, societies, different ways of living, and that might produce a different kind of awareness of difference of vibes, which could be helpful, right? Like my own little vibe, my own little world is one thing. That does not represent, though, all the vibes of all the other people across the world. That's a different kind of way of thinking about this. I just read something the other day. One of the new words for Gen Z is vibes. And I started laughing. It's like, well, they may be using it, but they didn't create the word. It's not new. It's been around for a long time, right?
Yeah.
On that note, like the word vibe within the American context has been around for at least 100 years.
Okay.
I think it's most associated with the hippies from the 1960s for obvious reasons, but you can read the beats, in other words, the poets from the 50s, they're talking about the vibe. You get references about the vibe in early jazz music, so early part of the 20th century. Over in European countries, the rise of occultism in the late 1800s, they talk about vibrations. Sufi mystics in the early 20th century talked about vibrations, actually using the word vibrations. Then you could trace this back to Qi, the Chinese translation of Qi's energy, going back more than 2,000 years. If you read Taoism, the book of the Way, which is the basic book of Taoism, I don't know if the word is actually mentioned there, vibe or vibration, but they mention Qi and energy. So one could translate that in that kind of way. You have the word prana, which is Sanskrit, going back 3,000 years, which means the vital life force. So as you can see, whatever we call this thing that we're talking about here, it has mutations and examples really throughout human history and across cultures. Interestingly, though, I think most people nowadays, at least within America, when they say the word vibe, they're not talking about all these other examples, which is fine, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times when they use the word vibe nowadays, it's kind of a throwaway word. Like, I caught a good vibe last night. And that could mean anything from emotion to I had a good time to whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because we need to set this word straight. I'm a big lover of language. And a lot of times when I hear a word thrown around, I know that it didn't start out that way. Somehow along the way, it got appropriated by a culture, whether that was, like you said, the hippies in the 60s, and it was used 40 years before that in the jazz age. Then it was used 1,000 years before that in a different way. Now it's like that game of telephone where it comes along down the line and the meaning gets a little jumbled up or confused. That's why I love to have conversations like this. And I'm curious if you have examples of maybe how our culture in the US has a little different vibe signature than a completely different culture from ours, and what that would look like.
It's a great question, and I'm hesitant to say too much because I don't want to think about it more.
Yeah.
But just as one example, in the past, I don't know, 5 years or so, I've been to Portugal twice. I went in 2018 to Lisbon, Portugal. And just this past summer, we went to Porto in Portugal. Both times I fell in love with Portugal. I mean, I love the culture. I love the people, love the food, everything about it.
I've only heard amazing things.
Yeah. If you haven't gone, go. And it's fairly inexpensive. Other than the plane ticket, it's a fairly cheap travel experience. One of the main reasons why I love Portugal is that the pace of life is much slower and much more laid back. Now, it's not so slow no one does anything, but it's just more friendly. It's more open. They don't stress about their day or their week, right? So on Sundays, for instance, it's a very communal affair. People sit outdoors. They watch the sunset together. When I'm home on Sundays, I'm worried about my next week. Like, oh my God, I got this work to do. I got this to do. I'm making lists. They're hanging out and enjoying life. And that itself is a different kind of vibe, right? And that's the baseline. I don't want to say too much, but as far as I know, that's the baseline of Portuguese culture compared to American culture, where it's fast-paced, overstressed, worrying about things all the time. It's a very different collective vibe that you experience. I think it's one of the great things about traveling. I would say every culture, every society, every country has its own vibe. And it's one of the reasons why we go to these other places, to experience something different. So I would definitely agree that each culture has its own vibrational signature.
Yeah, I can completely see that. Being in European places where life does move a little bit slower, they care about a lot of things, but they're just different things from what we in the US tend to care about. And it's evident in just their architecture and the way they move, carry themselves. And you're right, you can see it. It's all nonverbal communication, but it's not just body language. It's not just things you can see. It's something else that you can't quite put your finger on. And I guess that's where the vibe lives.
Totally, yeah. And just on one more note about Portugal, at least in Lisbon where I've been, they will actually use the word vibes in English. And then one of the other words they use, I know this from someone that lives there, the word waves. So when I was talking to this person talking about vibes, they said, well, we use the word vibe, like actually the word in English, but also use the word waves, like waving through space and time. So that's an example where the kind of a transcultural expression of the word vibes.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to vibes, where do you think a person's vibe comes from? Is it the way they were raised? Where do they get that vibe? Because you can have a family with a couple of kids. I know my own kids, like they've got way different vibes. One's super social, effervescent and bubbly, and one's like, just go away, just super introverted and completely different vibe. Same family, same parents, all that stuff, same environment they grew up in. So obviously we could also swap out the word personality for everything I just described, but it's not just personality. It's kind of a little extra layer like you've been talking about. So do you have any theories on where that comes from?
My first thought is that each of us is attracted to different kinds of vibes, attracted and detracted. So certain vibes we like and gravitate towards, certain vibes we don't like and we kind of move away from. One could assume that process starts really at the time of birth, give or take, right? Like you're born into the world. And if by chance this vibe thing is an actual real thing, and a lot of it works on a subconscious level, a level of being very subtle, then the human body, the human beings are already moving in certain directions without realizing it, right? I move towards this person because they give out a certain kind of vibe. And at the age of 1 year old, I have no idea why, but I'm moving towards this person. Or I'm moving away from that person towards someone else. And this whole process, though, really helps to constitute or shape both the personality, but also the vibration of that person.
Hmm.
So like I'm taking in a certain vibe and pushing away another kind of vibe. And I think that itself will cultivate a certain kind of vibe that I'm going to give off in future time.
That makes sense because it's energy, and energy attracts and energy repels, almost like magnetism. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Every time we come up with something else, it sends my brain in 7 different directions. So I'm like, wow, okay, so let's go down the rabbit hole. But you actually help people. In your bio, it said you do workshops. Are you helping people explore the concept of their vibe, or is that more on a different subject matter?
All of the above, really. Just like we're doing now, I'm happy to have conversations with anyone about anything relative to the vibe. It's fun for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I offer workshops, talks, obviously podcasts, interviews. I have a couple of self-paced online video lectures people can check out. And it's really about how do you put words to your experience and then turn a feeling into an idea, right? So most of us do talk about the vibe, but we do so in a way that's kind of a throwaway term, right?
Yeah.
I take it upon myself. It's like, well, how can I help individuals be more articulate about their experience? How can I help them understand their vibrational experience in a deeper way? How do we communicate with the vibe? How do we learn to distinguish between this vibe and that vibe, right? How do we bring those subconscious thoughts and experiences into conscious relief?
It sounds like that process would help someone become more aware of how they're showing up in the world.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And that's a huge part of what this podcast is about. The concept behind the podcast is really people who have been going through life, plugging away, doing all the things they were supposed to do to reach some sort of either stability or level in their life. And they've done a good job, but they look around and they're not really stoked about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to decide, okay, what do I do next? What risks do I need to take? What changes do I need to make in my life to have a blast, to enjoy it? And understanding something like your vibe and how you're showing up in the world can be huge, because that can open doors that you never thought would have been possible before. And that's why conversations like this are important for me to have, for people listening to hear, because there might be something we're talking about right now and it sets off a light bulb and they're like, oh yeah, they're talking about vibes and I didn't get it at first, but it's really how I show up in the world, how the energy that I bring either attracts or repels people. And that is pretty awesome. Let's say someone comes to you and they say, Jason, I know I'm not showing up in the world in the way I want to. And people have even given me the feedback. Let's say they are out of a relationship, they're trying to date, and they're just giving off those desperate vibes. I've heard that in one of my previous interviews was with a dating coach, matchmaker, and she was like, yeah, that's the worst thing you can do is kind of give off those desperate vibes or lonely vibes. It just repels people. That makes a lot of sense because no one wants anyone who they think is going to be clingy. So if someone comes to you and says, Jason, I need a vibe upgrade or renovation, you've already talked a little bit about checking in with your body, things like that. But what sort of path would you set them on, or what sort of work would you start doing with them if they needed to just level up?
I'll repeat some of what I've already said, as you just mentioned. So one, be more sensitive to your own body. That includes how you feel bodily, but also be aware of your own nonverbal communication. Be more sensitive to your surroundings in general. Be more sensitive to how people are reacting to you. And so how might you fine-tune your ability to read other people? So you want to read their nonverbals, you want to read their emotional states, and then read their vibe or the energy they're giving off, right? To do there, though, it's like as you're becoming more aware and more sensitive, hopefully you can fine-tune the vibe you're giving off, right? So your vibe is always in relationship to someone else or something else. It's a relational phenomenon. Right?
Okay.
So if you're giving off of desperate vibes, be aware of that and how people are responding to that. And from there, once you have that conscious awareness, you can start to fine-tune everything you're doing in your own life, whether it's mindset, nonverbals, your word choice, your punctuality or a lack of punctuality, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It really begins with yourself in relationship to other people or other things.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense, which leads me to this thing I've always wondered about. And I thought you would be the perfect person to ask about it. Talking about the fact that vibes are relational. They're either relational to something or someone. I've had the experience, and this has happened several times in my life, where I share a piece of music that I personally experience as beautiful and deeply soothing to me. And the person I share it with, who I actually know fairly well, it's not just someone I just met, but I know them pretty well, and they experience that same music as sad and depressing. That's how they would describe it. Is that related to our vibe, or is that something completely different?
Music is both a physical vibration, but also it's emotional, right? All music has an emotion to it, right? So if I'm a musician, I'm putting music out into the world, people are going to respond to it differently. There's no doubt about that. In terms of your example, not everyone perceives or orients to sad music as beautiful. So it could be both sad and beautiful, but the other person only picking out one part of that, right? You see it as sad, you acknowledge that, and you acknowledge the beauty in being sad. Just as you might acknowledge the beauty in being happy. But some people, though, they don't like sadness, so they shut themselves off from that music, that emotion, also that vibe. I don't want to overstep my balance here, but my advice for all humans would be, you're better off being open to all expressions of being human, not just certain expressions. No one wants to be sad all the time, but we have to admit and agree that is part of being human. And if you can find it in yourself to learn how to enjoy this one moment of sadness, right? It opens you up to that vibe, that emotion, also just being a well-rounded human being.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, though, it's probably not your place or my place to tell our friends, no, this is how you have to listen to the music. That's probably not going to go over well.
Right.
But I think that's part of the explanation. Not everyone wants to enjoy the full range of emotions or vibes.
Yeah.
Although I think we should. Not everyone's built that way.
I've definitely observed that for sure. If someone wants to connect with you, learn more about this, check out some of the other podcasts you've been on, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
The first place would go would be to go to my website, which is 20minutevibe.com. Again, 20minutevibe.com. It's a site about educating people about the vibe. So it's vibe-related content for those who are intellectually curious and progressively minded, in the hopes that you'll learn how to think more deeply and to connect more deeply with this thing that we call the vibe.
And you've been studying this for 30 years. So you've got depth of knowledge, of research. Where are you going from here? Based on what you've learned, what more are you looking into right now?
I'll answer it in two ways. One, I'm trying to get my ideas out there into the world about the vibe in a more public way, which is why I'm doing podcasts. So thank you for having me on your show. I really appreciate it. So how can I share my knowledge about the vibe with a wider audience? Then two, though, in terms of content-wise, I'm really open to everything. And one of the reasons why I want to do these podcasts or other interviews or workshops is that that's how I get ideas, right? So when people ask me questions that I haven't thought about before, it pushes me in new directions. So I really enjoy that. One of the topics I've been thinking about the past couple of weeks that might lead to other things in the future is the vibe and the good life. So the good life is a topic of interest for philosophers, poets, mystics, and sages throughout history, right? And how might the vibe tie into achieving, quote unquote, the good life?
Yeah. How do they correlate? Because so much of what we see right now is, hey, have good thoughts, manifest good thoughts, put good energy out. And like you said, so much of this overlaps, but it's not necessarily the thing that you would describe as the vibe, but they're all interconnected. So if someone does show up with great energy and great enthusiasm, they're probably going to have a completely different experience than someone who is showing up shut down and not involved. Completely different vibes, completely different outcomes. And you could probably, as a casual observer, predict which one was going to happen if you were just looking at it in a movie or something like that. So it's definitely relatable. People understand it. I just wanted to drill down on what it is outside of just being this pop culture term that everyone throws around.
Yeah, you nailed it on the head. Like, these are all things I want to talk about. This is fun.
It's been such a great conversation. Is there anything we didn't cover that you think is good for folks to hear if this is new to them?
It's helpful and instructive after listening to this podcast to take inventory of how often you either use the word vibe or hear the word vibe, or some variation. So vibes, vibrations, mood, energy, vibing, vibed last night. And you'll be surprised how often people actually use the term. And then from there, they'll ask yourself, like, well, is anyone defining it or explaining it? Like, what do they mean by the word?
Yeah.
A lot of people, if you said, what do you mean by that word vibe? Like, oh, the vibe. And it's not a critique. It's just it's an observation. They won't know what they're talking about.
Right.
So I take it upon myself, though, to help people understand what they're talking about. That's my job.
And you're doing a great job. And I appreciate you being here to help us understand it so much more.
This is super fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate
it was super
it.
fun. Thank you so much for joining me today. And be sure to come back next week. Oh, and can I ask a favor? I love connecting with people who have either led their own joyful rebellion or professionals who help others through that journey. So if you know someone like that, there's a big yellow button on the homepage at ajoyfulrebellion.com. I'd really appreciate you reaching out with a suggestion or introduction. Thanks again, and I'll see you back here next week.